Ava Thompson stood in her grandfather's garage, staring at what her cousins called a pile of junk. The rusty motorcycle looked worthless, its paint peeling and engine seized. Her relatives had already claimed the valuable antiques and jewelry, leaving her with what seemed like scrap metal. But as Ava began carefully removing decades of rust and grime, she noticed something that made her heart race. Military markings barely visible beneath the corrosion, and an engraved nameplate that would soon reveal a story of heroism that changed history. What she discovered next would transform this worthless inheritance into a national treasure worth millions. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The reading of Harold Thompson's will had been a spectacle of greed and disappointment, played out in the sterile conference room of Peterson and Associates law firm on a gray Tuesday morning in March. Ava Thompson sat quietly in the corner, her oil-stained work boots a stark contrast to her cousin's polished dress shoes and designer handbags. She had rushed straight from her auto repair shop, barely having time to wash the grease from under her fingernails, when the urgent call came that her grandfather's will was being read. Around the mahogany table sat the extended Thompson family, each member calculating their expected inheritance with barely concealed anticipation. Cousin Marcus drummed his manicured fingers against his leather briefcase, already planning how he would spend his windfall. His sister Victoria whispered to their mother about which antiques would look best in her newly renovated mansion. Uncle Robert cleared his throat importantly, adjusting his expensive watch as he prepared to assume control of what he believed would be significant family assets. Attorney Patricia Peterson, a severe woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, adjusted her reading glasses and began the methodical recitation of Harold Thompson's final wishes. The old man had been specific in his instructions, she explained, and had insisted that every detail be followed precisely, no matter how unusual some might seem. To my nephew Robert Thompson, she read in her measured legal tone, I leave my collection of vintage watches in my mahogany desk, along with the sum of $15,000. Robert's face fell slightly, as he had expected far more, but he nodded curtly and made notes in his planner. To my niece Margaret Thompson, the attorney continued, I leave my china cabinet, my mother's jewelry collection, and the sum of $20,000. Margaret's eyes lit up as she mentally cataloged the valuable pieces she remembered from family gatherings. One by one, Harold's possessions were distributed among his relatives. The antique furniture went to those who could appreciate its craftsmanship. The artwork found homes with family members who had admired specific pieces over the years. The substantial book collection was divided among the scholarly cousins who had actually read some of the volumes during their visits. As the list grew shorter and the amounts grew smaller, Ava found herself growing increasingly puzzled. Her grandfather had always been closest to her, spending countless hours in his garage, teaching her about engines and mechanics when she was young. He had been the one to encourage her unconventional career path, when the rest of the family disapproved of her decision to become an auto mechanic, instead of pursuing what they considered a more suitable profession for a woman. And, finally, Attorney Peterson announced, her voice taking on a slightly bemused tone as she reached the last page of the will. To my granddaughter, Ava Thompson, who alone among my relatives understands the value of things that others might overlook. I leave the contents of my workshop, including all tools, equipment, and one 1942 Indian motorcycle, currently stored in the garage. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in poorly suppressed snickers and outright laughter. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit stretching across his expanding waistline as he chuckled. Well, Ava, looks like you got the booby prize. That old bike hasn't run in decades. I doubt it's worth the metal it's made of. Victoria adjusted her pearl necklace and smiled condescendingly at her younger cousin. Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure grandfather meant well. But really, what are you going to do with a rusty old motorcycle? Perhaps you could sell it for scrap and at least get something for your trouble. Uncle Robert shook his head gravely, as if Harold's decision was evidence of declining mental faculties in his final years. I always told him that bike was taking up valuable space in the garage. Could have stored something worthwhile there instead. Still, I suppose someone has to clean it out. The extended family continued their commentary as they gathered their documents and prepared to leave. each secure in the knowledge that they had received the truly valuable portions of Harold's estate. They spoke over Ava's head as if she were not present, discussing their plans for their inheritances and expressing mock sympathy for her misfortune. But Ava sat quietly through the derision, remembering something her grandfather had told her years ago during one of their long afternoons in his workshop. "The most valuable things in life, little grease monkey," he had said with a wink, using his affectionate nickname for her, "are often the ones that other people are too quick to dismiss. Sometimes you have to look past the surface rust to find the real treasure underneath." 3 days later, Ava stood in her grandfather's garage for the first time since his funeral 2 weeks earlier. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings brought tears to her eyes as she surveyed the workshop that had been her second home throughout her childhood and teenage years. Every tool was exactly where Harold had left it, organized with the precision of a man who had spent 60 years perfecting his craft. In the corner, beneath a paint-splattered tarp that had seen better days, sat the motorcycle that had caused so much amusement at the will reading. Ava pulled away the covering with reverent care, revealing what most people would indeed consider a hopeless wreck. The 1942 Indian Scout was a study in decay and neglect. Rust had claimed large sections of the fuel tank and fenders. The chrome had long since given way to oxidation, and the leather seat had cracked and split from years of temperature changes in the unheated garage. The engine, visible through gaps where side covers had been removed, was seized solid with corrosion. Mice had made nests in the air cleaner housing, and spiderwebs stretched across the spokes of both wheels. To anyone without mechanical knowledge, the motorcycle would appear to be beyond salvation, suitable only for a scrapyard or perhaps as decoration in someone's man cave. But Ava saw something different as she walked slowly around the machine, her trained eye cataloging each component and assessing the scope of restoration required. The frame appeared solid beneath the surface rust, and the spoke wheels, while dirty and corroded, showed no signs of structural damage. Most importantly, all the major components were present, including several rare parts that would be nearly impossible to find today. She ran her hand along the fuel tank, feeling the solid construction beneath the deteriorated paint and surface corrosion. Indian motorcycles from this era were built to last, constructed with heavy-gauge steel and designed for reliability rather than disposability. With patience and skill, this machine could be brought back to life. Over the following weeks, Ava developed a routine that structured her days around the restoration project. She would arrive at her own auto repair shop before dawn, handling the urgent repairs and maintenance work that paid her bills and supported her modest lifestyle. By late afternoon, she would close the shop and drive the 15 minutes to her grandfather's house, which now belonged to Uncle Robert but remained empty while the family decided what to do with the property. The garage became her sanctuary, a place where she could work in peace, while surrounded by memories of her grandfather and the countless hours they had spent together learning the intricacies of mechanical systems. She had inherited not just his tools, but also his methodical approach to restoration work, the patience to disassemble complex mechanisms completely before attempting any repairs. The first month was devoted entirely to disassembly and cataloging. Ava photographed every component in its original position before removal, creating a detailed record that would guide the reassembly process. She carefully bagged and labeled every bolt, nut, and washer, organizing them in labeled containers according to the systems they belonged to. The engine, transmission, electrical components, and chassis were separated and prepared for individual restoration. As she worked deeper into the motorcycle's mechanical systems, Ava began to notice details that seemed unusual for a civilian machine. The wiring harness, while deteriorated, showed signs of military specification construction with heavy-duty insulation designed to withstand harsh environmental conditions. Several brackets and mounting points appeared to be modifications from the standard Indian Scout configuration, suggesting that this particular motorcycle had been adapted for specific purposes. Most intriguing was a small metal plate riveted to the frame beneath the fuel tank, hidden from casual observation but positioned where a mechanic would inevitably discover it during any major service work. The plate was heavily corroded, but traces of stamped lettering were still visible beneath the oxidation. Ava spent an entire evening carefully cleaning the plate with fine steel wool and penetrating oil. gradually revealing what appeared to be military identification numbers and a partial name. The discovery of the military markings added new urgency to the restoration project. Ava found herself staying later each evening, driven by curiosity about the motorcycle's history and the growing realization that her inheritance might be more significant than anyone had imagined. She began researching Indian motorcycle production during World War II, learning that many civilian models had been requisitioned or specially manufactured for military use. The engine restoration proved to be the most challenging aspect of the project. Decades of corrosion had seized the pistons in their cylinders, and the valve train was frozen solid with rust and ancient oil residue. Ava carefully disassembled the entire power plant, soaking components in penetrating oil and using every technique her grandfather had taught her for dealing with severely corroded parts. Working late one evening in November, 6 months after beginning the restoration, Ava made a discovery that changed everything. While cleaning the engine case with a wire brush, she noticed additional stamped markings that had been hidden beneath layers of paint and grime. As she carefully revealed each letter and number, a clear picture emerged. This was definitely a military machine, assigned to the European theater of operations during World War II. But it was the small brass nameplate riveted to the top of the transmission case that stopped her cold. As she polished away decades of corrosion with increasingly fine abrasives, letters began to emerge with startling clarity. The plate read, T/SGT James R. Matthews, 82nd Signal Corps, 1943–1945. Ava sat back on her heels, staring at the nameplate in wonder. Technical Sergeant James Matthews, whoever he was, had ridden this motorcycle during the war, probably through some of the most dangerous combat zones in Europe. The machine she was restoring was not just a vintage motorcycle, but a piece of history, a tangible connection to a soldier who had served his country more than 70 years earlier. That night, Ava could not sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions about Sergeant Matthews and how his motorcycle had ended up in her grandfather's garage. Harold had never mentioned owning a military vehicle, and she had never heard any family stories about connections to World War II veterans or military equipment. The next morning, she called in sick to her own shop for the first time in 3 years and spent the day at the public library, diving into military records and historical archives. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, was intrigued by Ava's quest and helped her navigate the complex web of digital databases and historical societies that maintained information about World War II personnel. By late afternoon, they had assembled a preliminary biography of Technical Sergeant James Robert Matthews. Born in 1920 in rural Nebraska, he had enlisted in the Army Signal Corps in 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor. His military records showed assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division Signal Company, where he had served as a motorcycle courier, carrying vital communications between command units and forward positions. The official records were sparse on details, but they painted a picture of a soldier who had been in the thick of some of the war's most significant battles. Sergeant Matthews had participated in the Sicily campaign, the D-Day landings at Normandy, and the push across Europe toward Germany. His service record showed multiple commendations, including a Bronze Star for valor and 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in action. Most remarkably, the records indicated that Matthews had been killed in action in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. He had died while attempting to deliver crucial intelligence about German defensive positions to Allied commanders preparing for a final assault on a strategic bridge. His body had been recovered, but his motorcycle had been reported as destroyed by enemy fire. Ava stared at the computer screen, trying to reconcile this information with the machine currently sitting in her grandfather's garage. If Matthews' motorcycle had been destroyed in combat, how had it ended up in civilian hands? And how had her grandfather, a man who had never served in the military, acquired what was apparently a piece of authenticated wartime equipment? That evening, she called her father, Harold's youngest son, hoping he might have some insight into the motorcycle's origins. David Thompson was a quiet man who had always maintained a somewhat distant relationship with his father, preferring his accounting practice to the mechanical pursuits that had consumed so much of Harold's attention. "Dad, did Grandpa ever tell you anything about where he got that old motorcycle in his garage?" Ava asked without preamble when her father answered the phone. David was quiet for a long moment, and she could hear him settling into his favorite chair, the one that creaked whenever he shifted position. "You know, honey, your grandfather never talked much about that bike. I remember it being there when I was a kid, but he always got strange when anyone asked about it. Said it was just something he was working on, but he never seemed to actually work on it much. Do you remember him ever mentioning a soldier named James Matthews?" Another long pause. "Matthews," David repeated slowly. "You know, that name does ring a bell. Not from your grandfather, though. From your grandmother. She used to get upset sometimes when your grandfather would spend time out in the garage. Said something about promises made to dead men. I never understood what she meant, and she would never explain when I asked." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of promises?" "I honestly don't know, sweetheart. Your grandmother could be very cryptic when she wanted to be, but I remember her saying once that your grandfather carried too much guilt about things that weren't his fault. She died when you were just a baby. So you never really knew her, but she had definite opinions about that motorcycle." After ending the call with her father, Ava returned to the garage with renewed determination. Somewhere in this machine or among her grandfather's papers, there had to be additional clues about the connection between Harold Thompson and Sergeant James Matthews. She began a systematic search of the workshop, examining every drawer, box, and shelf for documents or photographs that might shed light on the mystery. It was nearly midnight when she found the manila envelope tucked behind a workbench drawer, secured with masking tape that had yellowed and cracked with age. Her grandfather's handwriting on the envelope simply read, "For Ava, when she's ready to understand." Inside the envelope were photographs, letters, and documents that told a story more remarkable than anything Ava could have imagined. The photographs showed her grandfather as a young man, probably in his early 20s, wearing mechanic's coveralls and standing beside military vehicles in what appeared to be a motor pool or repair depot. Other images showed him working on motorcycles identical to the Indian Scout now in his garage. But it was the letters that provided the real revelation. They were correspondence between Harold and various military officials, dating from 1946 through the early 1950s. The letters revealed that Harold Thompson had been a civilian contractor working for the UB's Army in Europe immediately after the war, part of the massive effort to recover and catalog abandoned military equipment scattered across the continent. One letter, dated September 1946, specifically mentioned the recovery of a motorcycle belonging to Technical Sergeant James Matthews from a bombed-out German farmhouse where it had been hidden by French resistance fighters after Matthews' death. The letter instructed Harold to prepare the vehicle for shipment back to the United States, where it would be returned to Matthews' family in Nebraska. A subsequent letter, dated 6 months later, told a different story. Matthews' family had all been killed in a farming accident while he was overseas, leaving no one to claim his personal effects. The motorcycle, along with other unclaimed items, was scheduled for disposal or surplus sale. Harold's supervisor had authorized him to purchase the vehicle at scrap value if he was interested, noting that Harold had shown particular interest in preserving the machine's history. The final document in the envelope was a handwritten letter from Harold to his wife, never mailed but apparently kept as a record of his feelings about the acquisition of Matthews' motorcycle. In it, he described meeting survivors of Matthews' unit who had told him stories of the sergeant's extraordinary courage under fire. Matthews had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, carrying communications through enemy territory when radio contact was impossible or compromised. According to the letter, Matthews had saved hundreds of Allied lives by delivering intelligence about German positions, troop movements, and defensive preparations. His fellow soldiers described him as fearless but not reckless, a man who calculated risks carefully but never hesitated to act when lives were at stake. His death had been particularly tragic because it occurred during what should have been a routine mission, carrying orders for a delayed assault that might have prevented unnecessary casualties. Harold's letter expressed his determination to honor Matthews' memory by preserving the motorcycle in pristine condition, eventually donating it to a museum where future generations could learn about the sacrifices made by ordinary soldiers during the war. But life had intervened, Harold wrote. Marriage, children, and the demands of building a business had consumed his time and attention. The restoration project had been repeatedly postponed, always waiting for a more convenient time that never seemed to arrive. As Ava read her grandfather's words by the dim light of the garage's single bulb, she finally understood why he had left the motorcycle specifically to her. He had recognized her mechanical skills and her respect for history, trusting that she would complete the work he had been unable to finish. More than that, he had seen in her the patience and dedication required to honor properly the memory of a man who had given his life for his country. The restoration took on new meaning after Ava's discovery of the motorcycle's true history. Every component she cleaned and rebuilt was handled with the reverence due to a memorial artifact. She researched period-correct restoration techniques, determined to bring the machine back to its exact wartime configuration, rather than simply making it functional again. The fuel tank proved to be the most challenging component, riddled with corrosion from decades of moisture and contamination. Ava spent weeks carefully cutting out the damaged sections and welding in new metal, shaping each piece by hand to match the original contours exactly. The tank was then professionally stripped and repainted in the correct military olive drab color scheme, complete with stenciled identification numbers that matched the original specifications. The engine rebuild required skills that pushed Ava's expertise to its limits. Several internal components needed to be machined to restore proper clearances, and finding period-correct replacement parts required connections with specialty suppliers and vintage motorcycle collectors. Across the country, each part that could not be restored was replaced only with components manufactured to original specifications, maintaining the engine's authenticity while ensuring reliable operation. By the following spring, nearly a year after beginning the project, Ava was ready for the motorcycle's first start in more than 70 years. She had rebuilt every system from the ground up, replacing worn gaskets and seals, rewiring the electrical system with period-correct components, and even restoring the leather seat and saddlebags to their original appearance. The moment when the engine first caught and settled into a steady idle was emotional beyond anything Ava had anticipated. The sound of the restored Indian Scout filled the garage with the deep throb of mechanical perfection, exactly as it would have sounded when Sergeant Matthews rode it through the war-torn landscapes of Europe 7 decades earlier. But Ava's work was far from finished. The discovery of the motorcycle's historical significance had sparked her curiosity about other veterans of the 82nd Airborne Division's Signal Company, and she began reaching out to military historians and veterans organizations to learn more about Matthews' unit and their wartime experiences. Through the World War II History Museum in New Orleans, she made contact with Dr. Robert Chen, a military historian who had spent 20 years researching the role of motorcycle couriers in the European theater. Dr. Chen was fascinated by Ava's discovery and offered to help authenticate the motorcycle's provenance and document its historical significance. The authentication process took several months and involved detailed examination of every component by experts in military vehicles and World War II artifacts. X-rays of the frame revealed manufacturing marks consistent with motorcycles produced under military contract in 1942. Chemical analysis of paint samples confirmed the use of pigments and binders specified for military vehicles of that era. Most convincingly, comparison with known photographs of Matthews and his motorcycle showed an exact match for several distinctive modifications and battle damage. Dr. Chen's research had uncovered additional information about Sergeant Matthews that filled in many details missing from the official military records. Through interviews with surviving members of his unit and examination of after-action reports, a fuller picture emerged of a soldier whose courage and dedication had been instrumental in several major Allied victories. Matthews had been credited with delivering crucial intelligence that allowed Allied forces to avoid a costly frontal assault on heavily fortified German positions during the Battle of the Bulge. His report of a lightly defended approach route had enabled American troops to outflank the enemy and capture strategic objectives with minimal casualties. Similar missions had provided advance warning of German counterattacks, enabling defensive preparations that saved countless lives. Perhaps most remarkably, Matthews had continued his courier duties even after being wounded twice, refusing medical evacuation that would have removed him from combat duty. His final mission, the one that had cost him his life, had been volunteered for specifically because intelligence indicated the route would likely be suicidal. Younger soldiers with less experience had been assigned to the mission, but Matthews had convinced his commanding officer to let him take their place. As word of the motorcycle's discovery spread through military history circles, Ava found herself at the center of growing interest from museums, collectors, and veterans organizations. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History contacted her about the possibility of displaying the motorcycle as part of their World War II exhibit. The American Legion and veterans of foreign wars expressed interest in featuring Matthews' story in their publications and educational programs. But it was a phone call from an unexpected source that provided the most emotional connection to the motorcycle's history. Margaret Kowalski, a retired teacher from Lincoln, Nebraska, had learned about the discovery through a veteran's newsletter and reached out to share information about her family's connection to Sergeant Matthews. Margaret's grandfather, she explained, had been Matthews' commanding officer in the 82nd Signal Corps. First Lieutenant Stanley Kowalski had written extensively about his experiences during the war, including detailed accounts of Matthews' exploits and the circumstances of his death. More significantly, Lieutenant Kowalski had maintained correspondence with Matthews' girlfriend, a young woman named Patricia, who had worked in a defense plant while waiting for her fiancé's return from overseas. Patricia never married after James was killed, Margaret explained during their long phone conversation. She kept all his letters and photographs, always hoping that someday someone would want to hear his story. She died about 10 years ago, but she left everything to me, said I should find the right person to share it with when the, quote, time came. Margaret offered to send copies of Matthews' letters and photographs to Ava, along with Patricia's own account of their relationship and her memories of the man behind the uniform. The material provided intimate details about Matthews' personality, his hopes for the future, and his dedication to the principle that no sacrifice was too great if it could save the lives of his fellow soldiers. The letters revealed Matthews to be a thoughtful, articulate young man who understood the gravity of his situation, but faced each dangerous mission with quiet determination. He wrote eloquently about his love for Patricia and his dreams of returning to Nebraska to start a family and build a life together. But he never complained about the risks he faced or expressed doubt about the importance of his work. One letter, written just 2 weeks before his death, provided particular insight into Matthews' character and motivation. In it, he described a mission where he had delivered warnings that enabled an entire company to avoid a German ambush. I know these rides get more dangerous every day, he wrote to Patricia. But what I think about all the boys who will get to go home to their families because of information I've carried, I know it's worth whatever happens to me. Every message that saves lives is a message worth dying for. Armed with this wealth of historical documentation and personal testimony, Dr. Chen helped Ava prepare a comprehensive report on the motorcycle's significance and authenticity. The report confirmed that Matthews' Indian Scout was not just a restored vintage motorcycle, but a genuine piece of American military history, one of the few surviving courier motorcycles from the European Bayon theater of operations. The report caught the attention of Major General Patricia Williams, the Army's Chief of Military History, who personally reviewed the documentation and ordered an official investigation into the motorcycle's provenance. The Army's findings confirmed every aspect of Dr. Chen's research and formally recognized the motorcycle as a significant historical artifact worthy of preservation and display. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans offered to create a permanent exhibit featuring Matthews' motorcycle and the story of motorcycle couriers in combat operations. The exhibit would include interactive displays explaining the crucial role of battlefield communications and the extraordinary courage required of the soldiers who maintained those communications under fire. But before agreeing to any museum placement, Ava wanted to ensure that Matthews' story received the recognition it deserved within the military community itself. Working with Dr. Chen and the Army Historical Foundation, she organized a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery to honor Matthews and other motorcycle couriers who had given their lives in service to their country. The ceremony, held on Memorial Day 2 years after the motorcycle's restoration was completed, drew hundreds of attendees including veterans, active-duty service members, and families of soldiers who had served in communications units during World War II. The restored Indian Scout was displayed prominently near the tomb of the unknown soldier, its olive-drab paint gleaming in the morning sun, and its brass nameplate reflecting the solemn dignity of the occasion. General Williams delivered the keynote address, describing the vital role played by motorcycle couriers in maintaining battlefield communications before the development of reliable radio systems. She specifically honored Matthew's courage and sacrifice, noting that his actions had directly contributed to Allied victory in Europe and had saved countless American lives. Sergeant James Matthews embodied the finest traditions of the American soldier, General Williams told the assembled crowd. He understood that his individual sacrifice could make the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death for his fellow warriors. Through the dedication of Miss Ava Thompson, his story and his motorcycle will continue to inspire future generations of Americans to serve with the same courage and commitment." End quote. Following the ceremony, the motorcycle was transported to the National World War II Museum, where it became the centerpiece of a new exhibit titled "Courage Under Fire: Communications in Combat." The display included Matthew's letters and photographs, Patricia's recollections of their relationship, and detailed explanations of the motorcycle's restoration process. Ava was invited to attend the exhibit's opening ceremony, where she was formally recognized for her role in preserving and documenting this important piece of military history. Museum Director Dr. James Peterson noted that the motorcycle's discovery and restoration represented exactly the kind of historical preservation work that ensured future generations would understand the sacrifices made by previous generations. Ms. Thompson's dedication to honoring Sergeant Matthews' memory exemplifies the best of American values, Dr. Peterson said. Her work has transformed what others saw as worthless scrap metal into a powerful reminder of the courage and sacrifice that secured our freedom. The exhibit became one of the museum's most popular displays, drawing visitors from around the world who came to learn about the often overlooked role of military couriers in World War II. School groups regularly visited to hear the story of the young soldier who had given his life to save others, and many visitors left flowers at the base of the motorcycle's display case. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Department of Defense, after reviewing Dr. Chen's research and the Army's historical investigation, announced that Sergeant Matthews would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for valor in combat. The award recognized his extraordinary heroism and the life-saving impact of his courier missions throughout the European campaign. The medal was presented to Ava at a Pentagon ceremony attended by senior military officials and members of Matthews' extended family, relatives who had been located through genealogical research, and invited to witness their ancestor receive long overdue recognition for his service. The ceremony was particularly emotional because it represented the military's acknowledgement that Matthews' contributions had been undervalued in the immediate aftermath of the war. When the focus was on returning home rather than documenting individual acts of heroism. Standing in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, holding the Distinguished Service Cross that Matthews had earned more than 70 years earlier, Ava reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a seemingly worthless inheritance, mocked by relatives who saw only rust and decay, had become a gateway to preserving and honoring the memory of an authentic American hero. The success of the museum exhibit and the recognition of Matthews' service had transformed Ava's own life in unexpected ways. She had become something of a celebrity in military history circles, invited to speak at conferences and symposiums about the importance of preserving battlefield artifacts and documenting veterans' stories. Her auto repair shop had gained national attention, with collectors and museums seeking her expertise in restoring historical vehicles. More importantly, the project had connected her with a community of historians, veterans, and military families who shared her passion for ensuring that the sacrifices of previous generations were neither forgotten nor minimized. She had discovered a calling beyond fixing engines and transmissions. a purpose that combined her mechanical skills with a deeper mission of historical preservation and education. The motorcycle that had brought ridicule and dismissal from her family had become a source of pride and accomplishment that far exceeded any monetary inheritance. The cousins who had laughed at her booby prize now struggled to hide their embarrassment when friends and colleagues mentioned seeing Ava featured in military history documentaries and museum publications. But for Ava, the greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that Sergeant James Matthews' story would continue to inspire future generations long after she was gone. The motorcycle would remain in the museum's collection permanently, ensuring that visitors for decades to come would learn about the young soldier from Nebraska who had given his life to save others, and about the power of individual courage to change the course of history. Standing in her grandfather's garage one final time before the property was sold, Ava could almost hear Harold's voice whispering his approval of what she had accomplished. The workshop was empty now, the tools distributed among family members who would actually use them, but the memory of countless hours spent learning and working together remained vivid and precious. She understood now why her grandfather had chosen her specifically to inherit Matthew's motorcycle. He had seen in her not just the mechanical skills necessary for restoration, but also the patience and respect required to honor properly the memory of a fallen soldier. The worthless gift that others had mocked had become her most treasured possession, a reminder that the greatest value often lies hidden beneath surfaces that others are too quick to dismiss. The Indian Scout now rested in climate-controlled splendor at the National World War II Museum, surrounded by interpretive displays that told the complete story of its wartime service and eventual Bala. Discovery. Thousands of visitors each year paused to read Matthew's letters and examine the motorcycle that had carried him through some of the most dangerous missions of the European campaign. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the small brass plaque mounted beside the main display, which read, "Restored with honor and dedication by Miss Ava Thompson, who recognized the true value of what others had overlooked, ensuring that the courage of Technical Sergeant James R. Matthews will never be forgotten." The motorcycle that had once been nothing more than rusted metal gathering dust in a forgotten garage had become a symbol of heroism, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering those who had given their lives in service to their country. And Ava Thompson, the female mechanic who had been mocked for inheriting a pile of junk, had become the guardian of a legacy that would inspire Americans for generations to come. But the story did not end with the museum dedication. 3 months after the exhibit opened, Ava received an unexpected visitor at her auto repair shop. The man who entered looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair and the erect posture that marked him unmistakably as a former military officer. He introduced himself as Colonel William Barnes, United States Army, retired, and explained that he had traveled from Colorado specifically to meet her after learning about Matthew's motorcycle through the Bay Museum's publicity. "Miss Thompson," Colonel Barnes said, removing his uniform cap and setting it carefully on her workbench. "I believe I knew your grandfather during the war. Not personally, mind you, but by reputation." Harold Thompson was legendary among the civilian contractors working vehicle recovery in Europe. The soldiers called him Miracle Harold because he could resurrect machines that everyone else had, written off as total losses. Ava wiped her hands on a shop rag, studying the colonel's weathered face as he continued. "I was a young lieutenant in 1946, assigned to oversee equipment recovery operations in the British sector. Your grandfather saved my career when he managed to restore a command vehicle that contained classified materials we thought we'd lost forever. I never forgot his name or his reputation for bringing dead machines back to life." The colonel reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope similar to the one Ava had found in her grandfather's workshop. "When I heard about the Matthews motorcycle and your incredible restoration work, knew I had to come see you. You see, I have something that belongs with that machine, something I'd been carrying for almost 80 years, waiting for the right person to entrust it to." Inside the envelope were photographs and documents that revealed another layer to the Matthews story. Colonel Barnes, then Lieutenant Barnes, had been present when Matthew's body was recovered from the German farmhouse where he had died. The official reports had stated that the sergeant's personal effects were lost or destroyed, But Barnes had secretly retrieved something that had been overlooked by the recovery team. There was a small leather journal in his saddlebag, Barnes explained, his voice growing soft with memory. It contained notes about his missions, sketches of routes and landmarks, and personal observations about the war. I took it because I thought his family should have it, but when I learned they had all died, I didn't know what to do with it. I've carried it ever since, moving from base to base, deployment to deployment, always intending to find the right way to honor his memory. The journal was a revelation, containing information that filled gaps in the historical record about Matthew's service. His handwritten notes documented dozens of courier missions that had never been officially recorded, revealing the extent of his contributions to Allied intelligence gathering and communication. The sketches showed an artistic talent that none of his surviving letters had hinted at, detailed drawings of French yass, countryside, German fortifications, and the faces of fellow soldiers. Most significantly, the journal contained Matthew's own account of the mission that had cost him his life, written in pencil during what must have been his final hours. The entry described his decision to take a dangerous route through enemy territory because the standard roads had been compromised. He had known the risks, but believed the intelligence he carried was too important to delay. "They're planning something big for tomorrow morning," Matthews had written in his final entry. "I can't let the boys walk into another trap. This information has to get through tonight, no matter what it costs. If something happens to me, I hope someone will tell Patricia that I was thinking of her at the end. Tell her I tried to make it home to her." Dr. Chen was ecstatic when Ava contacted him about the journal's discovery. The handwritten documentation provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of motorcycle courier operations, filling a significant gap in historical understanding of battlefield communications during World War II. The journal would be professionally conserved and added to the museum exhibit, providing visitors with Matthew's own words about his experiences and motivations. But the discovery of the journal also triggered a new phase of research that would ultimately lead to even more remarkable revelations about Matthew's impact on the war effort. Working with military historians and archival researchers across Europe, Dr. Chen began cross-referencing Matthew's mission notes with German military records that had been declassified in recent years. The results were staggering. Time after time, Matthew's intelligence reports had provided crucial warnings that enabled Allied forces to avoid ambushes, locate weak points in German defenses, and coordinate attacks that minimized American casualties. His work had directly influenced major tactical decisions during some of the most important battles of the European campaign. One entry in particular caught Dr. Chen's attention. Matthews had written about discovering a hidden German ammunition depot during a reconnaissance mission in Belgium. His detailed report had included precise coordinates and descriptions of the facility's defenses. Allied bombing records showed that the depot had been destroyed 3 days later, eliminating a major source of supplies for German forces defending against the Allied advance toward Germany. Matthews wasn't just carrying messages, Dr. Chen explained to Ava during one of their frequent phone conversations. He was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence, and making tactical assessments that shaped the entire course of the war in Europe. His motorcycle mission saved thousands of American lives and probably shortened the war by months. The growing understanding of Matthew's true contribution to the war effort attracted attention from the highest levels of the military establishment. General Mark Davidson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, personally reviewed Dr. Chen's research and ordered a comprehensive study of motorcycle courier operations during World War II. The study, led by the Army War College, would examine the strategic impact of battlefield communications and the role of individual soldiers like Matthews in achieving Allied victory. Meanwhile, Ava found herself increasingly involved in efforts to document and preserve other pieces of military history that might otherwise be lost. The publicity surrounding Matthew's motorcycle had brought her to the attention of CRI, veterans' families, collectors, and museums across the country who sought her expertise in authenticating and restoring historical vehicles. Her first major project after the Matthews restoration involved a 1943 Willys Jeep that had been discovered in a barn in rural Montana. The vehicle had belonged to Captain Maria Rodriguez, one of the first Latina officers to serve in the Women's Army Corps During World War II, Captain Rodriguez had been assigned to coordinate logistics operations in the Pacific Theater, where her organizational skills and linguistic abilities had made her invaluable in communications with Allied forces from multiple countries. The Jeep restoration project connected Ava with Dr. Carmen Valdez, a historian at the University of California who had spent decades documenting the contributions of Hispanic Americans to the war effort. Dr. Valdez's research revealed that Captain Rodriguez had been instrumental in establishing supply lines that kept Allied forces operational during the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. These women and minorities served with distinction during the war, Dr. Valdez explained to Ava during their collaboration on the Rodriguez vehicle, but their stories were often overshadowed by the experiences of DAS. White male soldiers. Projects like yours help ensure that all of our veterans receive the recognition they deserve, regardless of their gender or ethnicity. The Rodriguez Jeep restoration took 8 months and involved challenges different from those Ava had faced with Matthew's motorcycle. The Pacific Theater's tropical climate had caused unique forms of corrosion and deterioration, requiring specialized techniques to address salt damage and humidity-related problems. Additionally, Captain Rodriguez had made numerous field modifications to her vehicle, adaptations that reflected the improvised nature of much Pacific Theater logistics operations. When the restoration was completed, the Jeep was donated to the Women in Military Service for America Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, where it joined a growing collection of vehicles and artifacts documenting the often overlooked contributions of women veterans. The memorial's director, Brigadier General Susan Martinez, noted that the Rodriguez Jeep helped illustrate the diversity of roles that women had played in achieving Allied victory. Ava's reputation as a military vehicle restoration specialist continued to grow, bringing opportunities that she could never have imagined when she first inherited her grandfather's worthless motorcycle. The Smithsonian Institution commissioned her to restore a 1944 Sherman tank that had been recovered from a French battlefield, and the National Museum of the Marine Corps asked her to work on a World War I ambulance that had served at Belleau Wood. Each project brought new historical discoveries and connections to veterans whose stories had been forgotten or overlooked. The Sherman tank had belonged to Sergeant First Class Robert Washington, an African-American tank commander who had served with distinction in an all-black armored unit. His tank had been instrumental in breaking through German defenses during the Battle of the Bulge, but racial segregation had prevented him from receiving proper recognition for his heroism until decades after his death. The World War I ambulance had been driven by Lieutenant Jennifer Adams, one of the first women to serve as a military driver in combat zones. Her service records showed that she had evacuated hundreds of wounded soldiers from forward aid stations, often under heavy enemy fire. Like many women veterans of that era, her contributions had been minimized in official histories that focused primarily on male combat troops. Working on these vehicles gave Ava a deep appreciation for the diversity of service and sacrifice that had characterized American military history. Each restoration project was not just about repairing mechanical systems, but about honoring the memory of individuals who had risked their lives for their country, often without receiving appropriate recognition for their courage and dedication. The success of her restoration work also brought financial rewards that transformed Ava's personal circumstances. Museums and collectors were willing to pay substantial fees for her expertise, and her auto repair shop began attracting customers from across the region who wanted their vehicles serviced by someone with her reputation for excellence and attention to detail. But perhaps more importantly, her work had connected her with a community of historians, veterans, and military families who shared her passion for preserving the stories of those who had served. She had become a regular speaker at military history conferences, where her presentations about the importance of mechanical artifacts and understanding warfare drew standing ovations from audiences of scholars and veterans. One particularly memorable conference presentation involved the unveiling of her latest discovery about Sergeant Matthew's service record. Working with European archives and battlefield archaeology teams, Dr. Chen had located the exact site where Matthews had died in 1945. The location, now marked by a small memorial, had been excavated by professional archaeologists who recovered fragments of his motorcycle and other artifacts from the crash site. The archaeological evidence confirmed details from Matthews' journal and provided additional information about his final mission. Analysis of the crash site showed that Matthews had been traveling at high speed when his motorcycle had been hit by German artillery fire. The trajectory of the debris indicated that he had been attempting to jump his motorcycle across a damaged bridge, a desperate maneuver that might have succeeded if not for the enemy barrage. Sergeant Matthews died as he had lived, Dr. Chen told the conference audience, pushing himself and his equipment to the absolute limit in service to his fellow soldiers. The archaeological evidence shows that he maintained control of his motorcycle even while under fire, attempting a jump that could have gotten his vital intelligence through to Allied commanders. The presentation was particularly emotional because it was attended by several descendants of soldiers whose lives had been saved by Matthews' courier missions. Through genealogical research and veteran family networks, Dr. Chen had located relatives of men who had survived ambushes, avoided artillery barrages, and escaped from dangerous situations because of warnings carried by Matthews on his motorcycle. One attendee, retired Air Force Colonel James Patterson, stood to address the audience about his grandfather, who had served in the same infantry company that had received several of Matthews' intelligence reports. "My grandfather lived to be 93 years old," Colonel Patterson said, his voice breaking with emotion. "He had 6 children, 15 grandchildren, and 22 great-grandchildren. None of us would be here today if Sergeant Matthews hadn't warned his unit about that German ambush in 1944. Similar testimonies from other families illustrated the ripple effects of Matthews' service, the generations of Americans who owed their existence to his courage and sacrifice. The mathematics were staggering. Hundreds of soldiers had survived the war because of intelligence that Matthews had delivered, and those survivors had gone on to raise families that now numbered in the thousands. The realization of Matthews' extended impact inspired Ava to propose an ambitious new project, a comprehensive database of World War II motorcycle couriers and their missions, designed to document the full scope of their contributions to Allied victory. Working with the Department of Defense and major military museums, she helped organize the Motorcycle Courier Heritage Project, an initiative that would identify and preserve the stories of all the soldiers who had served in similar roles. The project's first phase involved digitizing thousands of military records, mission reports, and personal accounts that had been scattered across various archives and collections. The work was painstaking and time-consuming, requiring teams of researchers to cross-reference documents and verify the accuracy of historical claims. But the results were remarkable, revealing the extent to which motorcycle couriers had influenced the course of the war. By the project's second year, researchers had documented more than 400 motorcycle couriers who had served in the European theater alone, with similar numbers for the Pacific and Mediterranean campaigns. Their missions had ranged from routine message delivery to complex reconnaissance operations, and their casualty rates had been among the highest of any military specialty. The database revealed patterns and trends that had been invisible when individual stories were examined in isolation. Motorcycle couriers had been disproportionately likely to volunteer for dangerous missions, and they had shown remarkable ingenuity in adapting their tactics to changing battlefield conditions. Many had developed personal techniques for avoiding enemy detection, and some had become legendary within their units for their ability to complete seemingly impossible missions. One of the most remarkable discoveries involved a network of courier routes that had connected Allied forces across multiple countries during the final months of the war. The routes, maintained primarily by motorcycle couriers, had enabled real-time coordination of military operations on an unprecedented scale. Matthews had been a key figure in this network, his knowledge of European terrain and enemy positions making him an invaluable asset for planning and executing complex missions. The Motorcycle Courier Heritage Project also led to the discovery of additional vehicles and artifacts that had been scattered across the globe since the end of the war. Working with international museums and private collectors, Ava helped identify and authenticate dozens of courier motorcycles, many of which had stories as remarkable as Matthews' machine. One particularly significant find was a 1941 Harley-Davidson that had belonged to Corporal Anthony Ricci, an Italian-American courier who had served in the Mediterranean theater. Ricci's motorcycle had been modified with armor plating and reinforced suspension to handle the rough terrain of North Africa and Italy. His service record showed dozens of missions behind enemy lines, carrying intelligence about German and Italian military movements. The Ricci motorcycle had been discovered in a private collection in Italy, where it had been preserved by a family who had helped hide the wounded courier after his motorcycle had been damaged during a mission in 1919 Mur. 43. Local residents had nursed Ricci back to health and kept his motorcycle safe until the area was liberated by Allied forces. After the war, Ricci had left the motorcycle with the family as a gesture of gratitude for their assistance. Restoring the Ricci motorcycle presented unique challenges because of the extensive battle damage it had sustained during its service. Multiple bullet holes in the fuel tank and engine cases told the story of missions conducted under heavy enemy fire. The armor plating showed impact marks from shell fragments and small arms fire, testament to Ricci's courage in completing his missions despite constant danger. The restoration project also uncovered evidence of field repairs that Ricci had made to keep his motorcycle operational under combat conditions. He had improvised replacement parts from salvaged materials and had developed innovative techniques for maintaining his machine with limited tools and supplies. His ingenuity and mechanical skills had enabled him to complete missions that would have been impossible for couriers with less resourceful approaches. When the Ricci motorcycle restoration was completed, it was displayed alongside Matthew's machine at the National World War II Museum, creating a powerful exhibit that illustrated the diversity of courier operations across different theaters of the war. The two motorcycles, one from the European theater and one from the Mediterranean, showed how couriers had adapted their equipment and tactics to meet the specific challenges of their assigned regions. The success of the motorcycle restorations inspired Ava to expand her work into other types of military vehicles. She began accepting projects involving aircraft, ships, and armored vehicles, each presenting unique technical challenges and historical significance. Her workshop, which had started as a simple auto repair shop, evolved into a specialized facility equipped with the tools and expertise needed for the most complex restoration projects. One of her most ambitious undertakings was the restoration of a 1943 P-51 Mustang fighter aircraft that had been discovered in a farmer's field in England. The aircraft had belonged to Captain Michael O'Brien, an Irish-American pilot who had been shot down during a bombing escort mission over Germany. O'Brien had survived the crash but had been captured and spent the remainder of the war in a German prisoner-of-war camp. The P-51 restoration required Ava to learn entirely new skills and to collaborate with aircraft restoration specialists from around the world. The project took 3 years and involved rebuilding the aircraft's engine, restoring its aerodynamic surfaces, and researching the specific paint schemes and markings that O'Brien's squadron had used during their combat operations. Throughout the restoration process, Ava maintained correspondence with O'Brien's family, who provided photographs and documents that helped ensure the aircraft's authenticity. O'Brien's son, retired Navy Captain Patrick O'Brien, became deeply involved in the project and shared stories about his father's experiences as a fighter pilot and prisoner of war. "My father never talked much about the war when I was growing up," Captain O'Brien explained during one of his visits to Ava's workshop. But after he retired, he started opening up about his experiences. He said the hardest part wasn't being shot down or being in the prison camp. The hardest part was knowing that his aircraft was out there somewhere, abandoned and forgotten, when it could have been flying missions to help end the war. End quote. The completed P-51 restoration was donated to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it became part of a comprehensive exhibit on fighter operations during World War II. The aircraft was displayed in the exact configuration it had carried during O'Brien's final mission, complete with authentic bomb damage and battle scars that had been carefully preserved during the restoration process. The dedication ceremony for the O'Brien P-51 was attended by several surviving members of his squadron, men who were now in their 90s, but who still remembered their young Irish colleague with affection and respect. Their stories about O'Brien's flying skills and combat record provided details that had never been included in official military histories. "Mickey O'Brien was the best natural pilot I ever flew with," recalled Sergeant Major Frank Kozlowski, who had served as O'Brien's crew chief. He could make that Mustang do things that shouldn't have been possible. He saved my life at least 3 times by bringing damaged aircraft home when any other pilot would have bailed out over enemy territory. The testimonies from O'Brien's squadron mates highlighted another aspect of military service that Ava's restoration projects had helped illuminate: the bonds between soldiers that transcended rank, ethnicity, and background. These men had served together during humanity's greatest conflict, and their shared experiences had created friendships that had lasted for more than 70 years. As Ava's reputation grew, she began receiving requests for restoration projects from international sources. The Royal Air Force Museum in London asked her to work on a Spitfire that had been flown by American volunteer pilots before the United States entered the war. The Canadian War Museum commissioned her to restore a Sherman tank that had been used by Canadian forces during the Normandy invasion. Each international project provided new perspectives on World War II and demonstrated the global nature of the conflict. Working with historians and veterans from other countries showed Ava that the war's impact had extended far beyond American borders, affecting families and communities around the world. The stories she uncovered during these projects illustrated the shared sacrifice and cooperation that had been necessary to achieve Allied victory. One particularly meaningful international project involved the restoration of a Royal Navy motor torpedo boat that had been used for covert operations along the French coast. The vessel had been commanded by Lieutenant Commander David Hartwell, a British officer who had worked closely with French resistance fighters to rescue downed Allied airmen and gather intelligence about German coastal defenses. The torpedo boat restoration required Ava to work with maritime archaeologists and naval historians to understand the vessel's complex mechanical systems and its role in clandestine operations. The project took 2 years and involved extensive research into wartime naval tactics and the technology of high-speed patrol boats. During the restoration process, Ava discovered hidden compartments that had been used to conceal rescued airmen and resistance fighters during dangerous crossings of the English Channel. The compartments contained personal items left by some of the people who had been rescued, including letters, photographs, and small mementos that provided intimate glimpses into their experiences. One letter, written by an American bomber pilot who had been shot down over France, described his gratitude to the British and French personnel who had risked their lives to bring him home. "These people don't know me from anyone," the pilot had written to his wife, "but they're willing to die to get me back to you and the kids. I'll never forget what they've done for me, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of their sacrifice." The completed torpedo boat was displayed at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where it became part of an exhibit on naval special operations during World War II. The display included artifacts from the hidden compartments and testimonies from some of the airmen who had been rescued by Hartwell's crew. The international attention that Ava's work had attracted also led to speaking opportunities around the world. She was invited to present at military history conferences in Europe, Australia, and Canada, where her expertise in vehicle restoration and her passion for preserving veteran stories made her a popular speaker. During a conference in Normandy, held to commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day, Ava met with officials from the French government who were interested in her restoration techniques. They offered to collaborate on projects involving vehicles that had been used by the French resistance, machines that had played crucial roles in preparing for the Allied invasion but had received little recognition in post-war histories. The French collaboration led to one of Ava's most emotionally challenging projects, the restoration of a civilian truck that had been used to transport Jewish families to safety during the Holocaust. The vehicle had belonged to Henri Dubois, a French farmer who had risked his life repeatedly to help Jewish refugees escape from Nazi-occupied territory. Dubois had modified his truck with hidden compartments similar to those found in the British torpedo boat, but designed to conceal entire families during dangerous journeys through German checkpoints. The restoration revealed evidence of the truck's humanitarian missions, including children's drawings scratched into the metal of the hidden compartments and small personal items that had been left behind by refugees. Working on the Dubois truck forced Ava to confront the darkest aspects of the war, the systematic persecution and murder that had made rescue operations like WWII necessary. The project required her to collaborate with Holocaust historians and survivors' organizations, groups that approached the truck's restoration with the reverence due to an artifact of human compassion in the face of unimaginable evil. The completed truck was displayed at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where it became part of an exhibit on rescue efforts during the Holocaust. The display included testimonies from families who had been saved by WWII and other rescuers, stories that illustrated the power of individual courage to preserve life and dignity even in humanity's darkest moments. Through all of these projects, Ava never forgot the motorcycle that had started her journey into military vehicle restoration. Matthew's Indian Scout remained on permanent display at the National World War II Museum, where it continued to draw visitors from around the world who wanted to learn about the young sergeant who had given his life to save others. The motorcycle had become more than just a museum exhibit. It had become a symbol of the broader effort to preserve and honor the stories of all veterans who had served with courage and distinction. Ava's work had demonstrated that history lived not just in official records and academic studies, but in the tangible artifacts that connected present generations with the experiences of those who had sacrificed for freedom and democracy. As she looked back on the decade that had passed since she first discovered the rusty motorcycle in her grandfather's garage, Ava realized that her inheritance had been far more valuable than any of her relatives could have imagined. The worthless pile of junk had opened doors to a career and a calling that gave deep meaning to her life, connecting her with heroes from the past and ensuring that their stories would continue to inspire future generations. The motorcycle that had once been mocked and dismissed had become the foundation for a legacy of historical preservation that would outlast any traditional inheritance. And Ava Thompson, the female mechanic who had been ridiculed for her grandfather's gift, had become the guardian of memories that reminded all Americans of the price of freedom and the value of individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds.